What happens when an entire nation's fate rests on the still waters of a silent lake? And the courage of a 27-year-old commander who refuses to surrender. The morning mist over Lake Erie was thick enough to swallow a man whole. The horizon blurred between sky and water, a gray sheet stretching endlessly into uncertainty. The crew aboard the small American fleet shifted restlessly, faces pale, hands trembling on ropes, slick with dew. The air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Somewhere beyond that mist, a British squadron waited, larger, better trained, and confident that the Americans would fall as they had before. But not today. Not if Oliver Hazard Perry had anything to say about it. Just a few years earlier, this same lake had been a place of peace. Fishermen casting lines, settlers ferrying goods between the newly founded towns along the frontier. But in 1813, the calm waters became a battlefield. The War of 1812 had dragged on longer than anyone expected. The British Navy ruled the seas, and the Great Lakes were their next frontier. If they could control Lake Erie, they would choke off the Northwest Territory, cutting American forces from supplying communication. The young United States, barely 3 decades old, would suffocate before it could grow. The British had the upper hand until Perry arrived. He was not what most imagined when they thought of a naval hero. Barely in his late 20s, soft-spoken, with a pale complexion and clear blue eyes that hid a steel resolve. The men called him the boy captain, though not to his face. Yet in that fragile youth burned something ferocious, a refusal to be humiliated by the greatest navy in the world. Perry had seen enough defeats, enough retreats. He wanted a victory, and he was willing to build it from scratch. When Perry was assigned to command the naval forces on Lake Erie, he arrived to find chaos. The shipyard at Presque Isle, what is now Erie, Pennsylvania, was little more than a swampy outpost. Tools were scarce, iron was rarer, and experienced shipwrights almost non-existent. The few sailors he had were farmers and woodsmen, untrained in naval warfare. The British, meanwhile, were building sleek, deadly ships in Amherstburg, across the lake in Canada. They had blockaded the coast for months, choking supplies to Perry's shipbuilders. Every day, the Americans looked out at the empty lake, knowing their enemies were out there waiting. But Perry refused to stop. Day and night, he worked alongside the men, hammering planks, hauling timber, and shaping the hulls of ships that would soon carry them to battle. The sounds of construction echoed through the trees, the rhythmic pounding of mallets, the hiss of saws, the smell of fresh pine and tar mixing with sweat and resolve. By midsummer, the fleet was ready. 9 vessels in total, a patchwork of small brigs and schooners, each one a symbol of defiance. The centerpiece of the fleet was the brig Lawrence, named after Captain James Lawrence, whose dying words, "Don't give up the ship," had become the rallying cry of the U.S. Navy. Perry had those very words stitched onto a great blue battle flag. When he unfurled it before his crew, the fabric rippled in the wind, catching the morning light like a promise. "Boys," he said, his voice calm, but cutting through the murmurs of the crowd, "this flag shall lead us into battle. Don't give up the ship!" Across the water, the British fleet under Commander Robert Heriot Berkeley prepared as well. Berkeley was a seasoned veteran, scarred and hardened from years of service under Admiral Nelson himself. But he was desperate. His supply lines were stretched thin, his men hungry and sick. Yet his ships, faster, heavier, better armed, gave him confidence. He believed this would be another swift victory for the British crown. On the morning of September 10th, 1830, the two fleets spotted each other. The lake was eerily calm, a mirror reflecting the vast emptiness of the sky. The wind was faint, barely enough to move the sails. Perry's fleet struggled forward, inching toward the British line. His men watched as the enemy ships loomed larger, their cannons glinting like the teeth of some great beast waiting to devour them. Then, at 11:45 a.m., a puff of white smoke burst from the British flagship, Detroit. A thunderous boom followed. The first cannonball screamed across the water and slammed into the side of the Lawrence, splintering wood, tearing through men. Blood and splinters sprayed through the air. Perry's ship had taken the first hit. For 2 hours, the Lawrence endured a relentless pounding. The British guns were longer ranged, their crews faster. Perry's cannons couldn't reach them. Men fell around him, bodies torn apart, screams blending with the roar of battle. Smoke filled the decks. stinging eyes and lungs. Still, Perry refused to retreat. He moved among his men, helping reload cannons, steadying those who When a young sailor hesitated, Perry placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Steady, lad. Victory favors the brave." But courage couldn't stop iron and fire. By early afternoon, the Lawrence was a floating wreck, its masts shattered, decks awash with blood. Only a handful of guns still fired. The ship was dying, and with it, the hope of victory. Perry looked around at the faces of his men, at the torn flags still fluttering above, and made a choice that would change everything. He turned to his brother, Alexander, and said, "I'll transfer the flag." Under a storm of enemy fire, Perry climbed into a small rowboat with a few sailors and began to cross the open water toward another American ship, the Niagara. Cannonballs splashed around them, geysers of lake water rising high into the smoke. The men rowed with everything they had, hearts pounding, arms burning. At any moment, a single shot could end them all. Yet somehow, miraculously, the boat reached the Niagara untouched. Perry climbed aboard, soaked, grim-faced, the blue flag still clutched in his hands. When he hoisted it on the Niagara, his men let out a cheer that cut through the chaos. The tide was about to turn. Perry gave the order to charge. With a sudden gust of wind, the Niagara surged forward, cutting through the enemy line at point-blank range. The cannons thundered, unleashing a storm of fire and iron that shattered the British ships. The lake exploded with sound, wood cracking, men shouting, the air thick with smoke and heat. One by one, the British vessels began to falter. The Detroit's rigging was torn apart, its guns silenced. Perry's ships closed in from all sides, surrounding the enemy like wolves. Within minutes, it was over. The smoke began to clear, revealing a scene of devastation. Ships floated, crippled and broken, their decks slick with blood. Perry looked out across the water, his own fleet in ruins, but the British utterly defeated. He took out a small piece of paper and wrote his now legendary message to General William Henry Harrison. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." It was the first decisive naval victory in American history, a turning point not just in the War of 1812, but in the nation's spirit. And yet, victory came with a price. As night fell over Lake Erie, the once sparkling water ran dark with oil and blood. The moans of the wounded drifted across the still surface. Perry walked the deck of the Niagara, silent, the adrenaline fading. Around him lay men, friends, who would never rise again. He had won the battle, but the cost of that victory would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the months that followed, Perry would be hailed as a hero, the savior of the Great Lakes, the man who proved that America could stand toe-to-toe with the British Navy. But behind the cheers, a quiet unease grew. Some officers whispered that he'd been reckless, that his bold charge had been luck more than strategy. And there were rumors. Rumors of a British retaliation brewing across the lake, vengeance for the humiliation at Erie. Perry, they said, knew it was coming. He could feel it, like the calm before another storm. And when that storm came, it would test not just his courage, but the very soul of the young nation he fought to defend. The smoke from the Battle of Lake Erie had barely drifted away before the uneasy silence began. The shattered masts still jutted from the water like gravestones, and the wind carried the faint smell of salt, blood, and burnt powder across the still lake. In the distance, the British flags had fallen. The American colors fluttered weakly above battered ships, their sails torn, their decks slick and red. Yet in that eerie, quiet victory didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like the wind whispering through the dead. Oliver Hazard Perry stood at the rail of the Niagara, staring into the fog that had begun to roll back in, his expression unreadable. Around him, the men moved slowly, exhausted and hollow-eyed, their uniforms soaked and blackened. They whispered his name, half in awe, half in disbelief, as if unsure whether they'd survived by skill or by some divine accident. Perry, however, was already thinking ahead. They had won the lake, but the war was far from over. Somewhere beyond those gray waters, the British still held Detroit, their armies gathering along the Canadian shore. The victory meant nothing if the lake could not be used to strike back. Perry knew what had to be done. and he knew the clock was ticking. 4 days after the battle, the wounded were ferried ashore. Makeshift hospitals filled the muddy banks of Putin Bay, where surgeons worked without rest. The cries of men echoed through the woods at night, mixing with the lonely calls of loons across the water. Perry walked among them, his uniform torn, his boots stained. He spoke little, offering quiet words or a firm nod to the injured. When one sailor, barely alive, reached up to grasp his hand, Perry didn't flinch. He stayed until the man's breathing slowed, until the light faded from his eyes. It was there, in those moments of unbearable stillness, that Perry realized the price of his message. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. The words had traveled fast, printed in newspapers, celebrated across the nation. But on the shores of Erie, those words lay heavy in the blood-soaked mud. General William Henry Harrison soon arrived at the lakeside, his boots crunching over the broken planks of the wrecked ships. He greeted Perry with a soldier's salute and a cautious smile. Together, they planned their next move, an invasion of Upper Canada, to finally drive the British from the northwest frontier. Perry's fleet would carry Harrison's troops across the lake, the same waters that had swallowed so many men days before. As the wind rose and the ships creaked against the docks, Perry looked out over the water and felt a strange pull. He had proven himself, yes, but deep down, he knew this victory was only a reprieve. War was never satisfied with a single offering. It always demanded more. By late September, the American army boarded Perry's ships, their muskets glinting under a pale sun. The Niagara led the way, its hull freshly repaired, its sails patched but proud. The British forces, weakened and retreating under the command of General Henry Proctor, fell back from Detroit, dragging along their native allies under the great Shawnee leader, Tecumseh. For years, Tecumseh had fought to protect his homeland from American expansion, forging alliances, building confederacies. He was no British pawn. He was a man fighting for a dying world. Perry and Harrison pursued them across the lake, landing near the mouth of the Thames River. The land there was dense with marsh and forest, the air heavy with the scent of rain and gunpowder. What followed would be remembered as the Battle of the Thames, a swift, brutal clash that shattered British hopes in the region. Proctor's men scattered, their lines broken, their will gone. Tecumseh stood his ground. Surrounded, outnumbered, he refused to flee. When the smoke cleared, he was gone, his body never officially identified, his death shrouded in legend. Perry was there when it ended. He watched Harrison's men celebrate, cheering in the rain, while he stood apart, staring at the silent trees. Another victory, yes. But again, he felt that same hollow ache. How many victories could a man endure before they all began to feel like losses? As winter fell, Perry returned to the eastern ports, hailed as a hero. Crowds cheered him through the streets of Newport and Philadelphia. Children waved flags. Newspapers called him the hero of Lake Erie, and women threw flowers from balconies. Yet in the midst of the celebration, Perry felt an unease he couldn't shake. He wrote letters late into the night to his wife, his brothers, his superiors. In them, his tone shifted between pride and melancholy. "Victory," he wrote once, "comes not with joy, but with the burden of memory." The images of that day haunted him, the faces of the dead, the drifting ships, the screams muffled by the roar of cannon fire. The world saw glory, he remembered. Silence. But the war had not finished with him yet. In 1814, tensions rose again on the Great Lakes. Command, disputes, rivalries, and accusations swirled among the officers who had once fought at his side. Perry found himself entangled in bitter politics. His second-in-command at Erie, Jesse Duncan Elliott, accused him of arrogance and recklessness. Letters were leaked to the press, reputations smeared. The Navy, once united by survival, now tore itself apart from within. It was in the courtroom, not the battlefield, that Perry faced his next fight. Before a panel of senior officers, he defended his actions, the charge, the transfer of command, the blood that bought victory. Witnesses came and went. Some spoke for him, others against. Yet through it all, Perry's composure never broke. When his chance came to speak, he said simply, "If to save my country's honor I was bold, then I ask no pardon for that courage." The verdict cleared him, but the scars of pride and rivalry never fully faded. He continued to serve, but his fame became both a blessing and a curse. Every command he received carried expectations too heavy for one man to bear. In 1819, Perry was sent on a diplomatic mission to Venezuela, a chance, perhaps, to escape the shadows of his own legend. The mission was meant to strengthen ties with the young republics of South America, but fate had other plans. The voyage south was brutal. The air grew thick with tropical heat, the wooden decks crawling with insects. Disease spread quickly among the crew. Yellow fever, the silent killer of the seas. Perry tended to his men personally, refusing to isolate himself in the captain's quarters. When they begged him to rest, he shook his head. "If they suffer, I will suffer with them," he said softly. But courage could not shield him from nature's hand. Within days, he too fell ill. Fever burned through him, his skin pale and clammy. As the ship approached the harbor of Port of Spain, he could barely lift his head. The man who had faced cannon fire without flinching now fought an invisible enemy that cared nothing for bravery or rank. On August 23rd, 1819, Oliver Hazard Perry died aboard his ship, far from Lake Erie, far from the cold northern waters where his legend had been born. He was 34 years old. When news reached the United States, the nation mourned deeply. Bells tolled in Newport, flags hung at half-mast, and newspapers printed black-bordered tributes to the fallen hero. But among the mourning, a strange quiet lingered, the kind that comes when a story ends too soon. They buried him by the sea, where the waves crash endlessly against the shore. And even now, on the cold mornings along Lake Erie, some say the mist still carries the faint echo of cannon fire, a reminder of the day a young commander refused to give up his ship. But history, as it often does, would not rest. Years later, whispers began to surface about what truly happened on that lake, about the men who claimed the glory and those who carried the blame. Letters lost, orders rewritten, names erased or elevated, depending on who told the story. Was Perry's victory as pure as the legend claimed? Or had there been another hand guiding the storm that day, one history chose to forget? The answers, buried in logs and letters, would begin to surface decades later, and what they revealed would cast a shadow over the shining image of America's first great naval triumph and over the man who became its symbol. The truth, it seemed, was still drifting somewhere out there, waiting to be found beneath the quiet surface of Lake Erie. To be continued. The truth, they said, was still drifting beneath the surface of Lake Erie, and it would take years before the murky waters began to stir again. By the mid-1800s, America had changed. The war that had once defined its youth was now a story told in classrooms and taverns, a heroic legend softened by time. Paintings of Oliver Hazard Perry hung in state halls, his posture noble, his gaze fixed on some unseen horizon, the banner "Don't Give Up," the ship billowing behind him in eternal triumph. The tale was clean, simple, victorious. But beneath the varnish of history, whispers persisted, letters that didn't match official reports, testimonies that contradicted one another, accounts of orders ignored, and commands disobeyed. It began quietly, with a naval historian, a man named Thomas McKee, who had spent years combing through the forgotten archives of the War Department. He wasn't looking for scandal. He was searching for clarity. The deeper he went, the stranger the records became. Some of Perry's own dispatches appeared rewritten in another hand. The logs of the Niagara on the day of battle had missing pages. Even the surviving crew members' testimonies, collected years later, didn't align. McKee began to suspect that the story America had chosen to tell, the clean, heroic version, might have been polished too perfectly. One name kept resurfacing: Jesse Duncan Elliott, Perry's second-in-command. The man who had once accused him of arrogance and misconduct. The man whose silence during the heat of battle had nearly doomed them all. Or so the legend claimed. But as McKee followed the threads of old correspondence, a new picture emerged. Letters written by sailors under Elliott's command suggested that the Niagara had not been held back out of cowardice, but confusion. That Perry's desperate transfer from the crippled Lawrence might not have been the stroke of genius history celebrated, but a reckless gamble that barely avoided catastrophe. It was a dangerous idea to question the sanctity of a national hero. But the more McKee uncovered, the more he realized that history wasn't carved in stone. It was written in ink, and ink could be smudged. He found one particularly haunting account from a midshipman named Henry Lobb, a survivor who had later written to his brother about that day. Captain Perry was calm, but his eyes, there was something in them, a kind of fury I cannot describe. He moved as if he could not hear us, as if the world had narrowed to a single thought. When he left the Lawrence, I swear to you, he looked like a man walking into his own grave. Loeb's words lingered like a ghost. Had Perry known, even then, that victory would cost more than he was willing to admit. McKee began to publish his findings in small journals, carefully, cautiously. He wasn't accusing, he was questioning. But the reaction was immediate and fierce. Veterans groups called him a defamer of heroes. Politicians condemned him as unpatriotic. And yet, others began to listen. The cracks in the legend were too intriguing to ignore. What if Perry's glory had come not from flawless command, but from desperation? What if his courage had been driven by guilt? I need to prove something not just to his men, but to himself. As McKee's research spread, something unexpected happened. The descendants of Perry and Elliot entered the conversation. Letters long hidden in family chests surfaced, and with them, private confessions never meant for public eyes. In one of Perry's final letters, written during his voyage south before his death, he mentioned the Battle of Lake Erie, not as triumph, but as torment. "The lake still calls to me," he wrote. "In its silence, I hear the voices of those I could not save." That single line changed everything. It turned victory into haunting, heroism into burden. And as McKee delved deeper, the mystery grew darker. In 1820, just months after Perry's death, a naval clerk named Samuel Green had recorded a brief, almost forgotten note. Artifacts recovered from Erie, including a flag and certain papers belonging to O.H. Perry, to be sealed and stored per orders from the Navy Board. The items were never cataloged. The location of that sealed chest was lost. For over a century, no one knew what it contained. Until one cold November morning in 1887. A storm had swept across the Great Lakes, fierce and unrelenting, tearing through docks and fishing boats. When the water finally receded, workers near Presque Isle uncovered something buried deep in the shoreline mud, an old iron-bound chest, its hinges rusted, its surface marked with faint lettering. Inside were water-damaged documents, fragments of uniforms, and a small folded flag, blue, with the words barely visible through the stains. "Don't give up the ship." The newspapers went wild. Perry's flag found blared the headlines. Crowds gathered to glimpse the relic, now displayed under glass in a local museum. But when McKee examined the papers within, his breath caught. Among the fragments was a partially legible letter addressed not to General Harrison, but to the Navy Department, written the day after the battle. The handwriting matched Perry's. The ink was faint, but decipherable. It read, "We have met the enemy, and nearly met our ruin. The men fought with valor, though command was lost in confusion." I cannot say how the tide turned, only that it did, and by some providence, we are alive. It was enough to shake everything the country thought it knew. The phrase, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," had become a monument to victory, carved into stone and memory. But this alternate letter, this confession of chaos, told a different story, a story where victory was not mastery, but survival. McKee tried to bring it to light, but the Navy, fearing scandal, suppressed it. The letter vanished again, locked away in a Washington archive, sealed for historical preservation. Only a single photograph of the document survived, tucked away in McKee's personal notes, which were discovered years later after his death. The irony was cruel. Perry had fought to ensure that truth survived beyond the fog of war, and yet his own truth was buried in it. As the decades rolled on, historians argued endlessly. Some claimed the second letter was a forgery, a fabrication to stir controversy. Others believed it was genuine, proof that Perry's greatest victory had been a narrow escape from disaster. But even among those who defended him, a strange shift occurred. Perry ceased to be a marble statue of perfection. He became something more human. A man terrified, fallible, driven by both duty and doubt. And perhaps that was the real legacy! For beneath every flag, every victory cry, there are moments of hesitation that history dares not speak. A commander's trembling hands. A sailor's whispered prayer. The sick realization that glory is often nothing more than survival dressed in ceremony. In the quiet halls of the Naval Academy today, Perry's blue flag still hangs. Tourists stare at it. School children memorize its words, but few notice the faint discoloration near its edge. A dark patch that experts say might be blood, though no one can prove whose. It's fitting, perhaps, that even in preservation, truth refuses to stay clean. And yet, the lake itself never gives up its secrets so easily. In the summer of 2012, divers exploring the cold depths near Put-in Bay reported something strange. A shape half buried in silt, covered in algae and the bones of decades. At first, they thought it was driftwood or an old dock post. But as their lights cut through the dark, outlines appeared. Planks, ribs of a hull, and a single corroded cannon lying in silence. The sonar scans confirmed it, a wreck from the early 19th century, likely one of Perry's forgotten ships. The discovery reignited the old questions. What else lay down there, sealed beneath time and water? Were there more documents? More fragments of truth resting in the cold? The divers returned weeks later with better equipment, but the lake had changed. The currents had shifted, burying the wreck in mud again. It was as if the lake itself had decided to reclaim its secrets. But among the few recovered artifacts, one stood out, a piece of wood, carved faintly with words that time had almost erased. The inscription read, "No man commands the storm." Whether it had been etched by a sailor, a prisoner, or Perry himself, no one could say. But those 5 words felt like a whisper from the deep, a reminder that even the greatest victories are won not by control, but by surrendering to forces far beyond human reach. Standing on the shore that summer, one of the divers, a woman named Eleanor Brooks, watched the sunset bleed into the lake and said quietly to the cameras, "It's strange. We remember heroes as if they conquered the world. But maybe the truth is they were just men trying not to drown." And in that moment, the story of Oliver Hazard Perry, the hero of Lake Erie, the symbol of victory, shifted again. No longer a myth carved in marble, no longer the unshakable statue of triumph, but a man caught between duty and doubt, victory and loss, forever reaching for something just beyond the horizon. Yet one question still lingers, heavy and unresolved. If the flag was found near the shore, then what was it doing there? Far from the wreck where Perry last held it. Somewhere in that answer, perhaps, lies the final truth about the first great naval victory of the United States, a truth the lake still keeps beneath its endless gray surface. And as the wind rises over those waters once more, it almost sounds like a whisper. A voice from another time. A reminder that even victory, once told enough times, becomes a mystery all its own. To be continued. The silence after the last words lingered like a bruise in the air, soft, tender, but throbbing beneath the surface. It was as if the world itself hesitated to breathe, waiting for something to give. The wind outside carried a faint hum, brushing against the windows like distant whispers trying to reach inside. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of old wood, the uneven rhythm of footsteps down the hallway, the faint tremor of breath being held too long. Something was shifting, unseen but undeniably near, and everyone could feel it pressing against them. That sense that reality itself was beginning to fracture. The discovery from before had left more questions than answers. And yet, beneath all the confusion, a darker certainty began to take root. It was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about surviving what was coming next. The air in the room had changed. It carried weight now, an invisible gravity that pulled everyone's thoughts toward one single point they didn't want to face. They tried to reason, to rationalize, but every explanation only led them deeper into the same pit. That maybe this wasn't about fate or coincidence. Maybe it was all designed. One by one, they started seeing things that didn't belong, reflections that didn't match their movements, voices echoing sentences that hadn't been spoken yet. It wasn't hallucination. It wasn't madness! It was something colder, something intelligent, watching from just beyond the edges of perception. And yet, In that growing dread, there was also a quiet pull, curiosity, temptation. They need to know why. The main character, who had once carried a quiet resolve, now seemed caught between defiance and surrender. Every memory from the past began to take on new meaning. Faces once trusted now looked different in recollection. Eyes too sharp, smiles too deliberate. Conversations replayed in the mind like fractured recordings, revealing patterns that were invisible before. Something had always been guiding them here, step by step, decision by decision. And that realization was far more terrifying than any physical threat. Nights grew longer. Or maybe time was simply collapsing in on itself. They would wake to find hours missing, clocks frozen mid-tick, candles burnt down faster than they should have. The boundaries between what was real and what was imagined blurred until both felt indistinguishable. There was a rhythm to it, a pulse, as if whatever force haunted them was syncing with their own heartbeat. And then, one night, the rhythm broke. It began with the sound low, almost imperceptible at first, like a vibration crawling through the floorboards. The walls shuddered softly, dust falling in thin lines from the ceiling. And the room seemed to pulse with it, like the house itself was breathing. They moved toward the center, drawn by instinct, not reason, because something deep inside whispered that the answer was finally here. And when they saw it, that faint shimmer of light spilling from beneath the old trapdoor, the air around them seemed to thicken, humming with anticipation. There was fear, of course, but it was different now. Not the paralyzing kind that roots you in place, but the sharp, burning kind that demands action. They opened it, slowly, and the air that escaped felt ancient, heavy with something that didn't belong to this century. The light below flickered like liquid gold, revealing stairs that descended into shadow. No one spoke. No one had to. They all knew the same thing. Once they went down, there would be no coming back unchanged. The descent felt endless. The sound of their footsteps echoed too long, as if the walls swallowed the noise and then gave it back, distorted. The further they went, the colder it became, but not the kind of cold that comes from temperature. This was something else, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and whispers that you've crossed into a place that was never meant for you. And at the bottom, they found it. The chamber was vast and hollow, its walls marked with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dark. In the center stood the same emblem that had haunted their dreams, now real and alive, carved into stone, surrounded by objects that looked both sacred and mechanical. It was as if this place had existed outside time, a relic of something older than history, but more advanced than the present. There was a table, or what resembled one, and upon it, something wrapped in a thin, black cloth. They approached, hesitant but entranced, and as the cloth was pulled away, what lay beneath wasn't what they expected. Not an artifact, not a weapon. A mirror. Small, cracked along one side, but alive with a faint, pulsing glow. The reflection that stared back wasn't quite their own. It shifted, almost imperceptibly, its expression a heartbeat out of sync. Then, slowly, it began to move differently. Smiling when they didn't, eyes narrowing when theirs widened. And in that instant, they understood. It wasn't showing them who they were. It was showing them what they would become. Panic rippled through the group, but one of them couldn't look away. Something in that reflection called to them, like a voice without sound. It promised answers, power, release. They reached out instinctively, fingertips brushing the cold surface, and the room erupted into motion. The air convulsed, wind roaring from nowhere. The walls trembling, as if the whole chamber had come alive. The others screamed for them to stop, but it was too late. The mirror shattered, light pouring out like smoke and swallowing everything in blinding silence. When it cleared, the one who had touched it was still standing, but changed. Their eyes, no longer fully human, seemed to see through everything. The others backed away, terrified. But there was something else to sorrow, because they knew, somehow, that whatever had taken hold wasn't entirely foreign. It had been waiting within all of them. The days that followed were chaos. Reality began to splinter around them, flashes of past and future intertwining, moments repeating and collapsing. They tried to leave, but every path led back to the same place. The same room. The same cracked mirror now pieced back together on its own. And then came the whispers. They weren't from outside, they came from within. Voices layered upon each other, speaking truths that no human should ever hear. One voice in particular was clearer, colder. It spoke of purpose, of the price of awakening, of the illusion they had mistaken for choice. It said they were never discovering the truth. They were fulfilling it. That realization broke something in them. For the first time, the protagonist didn't feel like the victim of some external force. They felt complicit. Every choice, every curiosity, every desperate attempt to understand had been part of the design. The thing that haunted them had never been hunting. It had been calling, and they had answered. Outside, the first light of dawn began to rise, but it didn't bring relief. The world looked the same, yet not. The air shimmered faintly, like a veil had been lifted, and behind it was something far vaster, far more alive than they could comprehend. For a fleeting moment, they felt peace, a calm that wasn't comfort, but acceptance. Then the voice returned, closer this time, whispering their name. And in that whisper was a truth too heavy to bear. It had never been about finding what was hidden. It was about remembering what was forgotten. The protagonist froze, heart pounding, realizing what that meant, and as they turned, the final image burned into their vision. Their own reflection, standing just behind them, smiling as if it had been waiting all along. And then, just as the light touched their face, everything went silent, the kind of silence that doesn't mean calm, but the moment before the world breaks. The reflection didn't move at first. It stood perfectly still, its faint smile carved into something that felt almost human but wasn't. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. The air thick enough to taste. The room seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated through the bones, through the mirror, through time itself. And then, without warning, the reflection blinked. Once. Slowly, deliberately. And in that single motion, the line between what was real and what was reflection vanished. A pulse of light rippled outward, soundless but deafening in sensation, like the world itself exhaled. The walls shuddered, shadows bending in unnatural arcs, as though they were drawn toward that single glowing figure. The protagonist staggered back, but the reflection followed the movement. Not inside the glass, outside of it. Every step mirrored in perfect opposition, a choreography of dread. The air rippled again, and the reflection stepped forward. This time, it didn't stop at the surface. The glass didn't shatter, it dissolved. It turned to liquid light, spilling outward and reforming into a haze of faces, voices, and memories. Fragments of every moment that had led to this one. Laughter, fear, anger, and love, all blended into a single, overwhelming chorus. The protagonist felt it pulling them inward, dragging their consciousness into something vast and ancient. It wasn't possession, it was recognition. Because in the reflection's eyes, they saw themselves not as they were, but as they had always been. Every version, every decision, every lifetime of choices that had led them here. It wasn't one story being told. It was all stories collapsing into a single truth. The realization hit like lightning. This wasn't a haunting. It was a convergence. The past, the present, the illusion of future, all folding inward. They weren't being shown destiny. They were being returned to origin. They screamed, but the sound broke apart into static, disintegrating before it reached the air. The reflection stepped closer, and now the protagonist could see details, the faint scar across the cheek, the way the pupils shimmered like fractured glass, the tiny tremor of pain behind the calm. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't kind either. It simply was. The light surged, filling the chamber with a blinding radiance that painted every shadow in gold. The others, the ones who had followed them down here, fell to their knees, eyes wide, mouths open, in silent horror, or the air trembled, as if the world itself was straining under the weight of what was being revealed. Symbols on the walls ignited, glowing brighter than fire, rearranging themselves into shapes that no human mind was meant to comprehend. And then, everything stopped. Silence. Pure, total, terrifying. The light dimmed, revealing the protagonist alone. The others were gone, not vanished, not erased. but simply not there anymore, like they had stepped sideways into another strand of existence. The mirror stood whole again, but this time it reflected a different world. A world where the sky was split open, where cities crumbled into sand, where time seemed to flow backward and forward at once. It wasn't prophecy. It was memory. The memory of what had already happened, again and again, across every cycle of human existence. The reflection spoke at last. Its voice wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, an echo vibrating in the marrow. "You wanted truth?" it said. "This is it. The end and the beginning are the same. You do not uncover what was hidden, you become it." The protagonist stepped closer, trembling, anger and awe, twisting together like fire and smoke. "Why me?" they whispered. "Why any of this?" The reflection tilted its head. "Because you asked. Because you looked too long into the question, and the question looked back." And then the light flickered again. Not bright this time, but soft. Gentle. The fury of revelation softened into something deeply human. The reflection's expression changed. It wasn't smiling anymore. It looked sad, as if burdened by what it had to show. It lifted a hand, the same hand the protagonist had reached out with before, and pressed its palm against the glass. The protagonist did the same. The moment they touched, the room filled with visions, memories not their own, but shared across time. They saw the first hand that built fire, the first voice that cried out against the dark. The wars, the peace, the endless repetition of creation and destruction. They saw themselves through every age. Different faces, same soul. And beneath it all, one recurring truth pulsed like a heartbeat. Every generation believes it is uncovering the mystery, but in truth, it is reliving it. The mirror was not a portal, it was a reminder, a reflection of the cycle. Tears blurred their vision. They could feel the reflection's hand trembling against theirs, as if even it longed for release. The walls began to collapse into light once more, symbols burning away like paper touched by flame. The chamber started to disintegrate, the air bending and folding, pulling everything toward a center point where light and darkness met. It was beautiful and terrifying. A storm of unmaking and rebirth. The protagonists could feel themselves unraveling, each memory, each fear, each heartbeat peeling away until there was nothing left but the core of what they were consciousness suspended between being and nothingness. And in that weightless silence, the reflection whispered one last time, "Now you see. There was never a difference between you and me. I was the truth. You tried to run from the part of you that remembers everything." The words lingered even as the reflection began to dissolve. The mirror turned to dust, each particle of light rising into the air like fireflies, drifting toward the ceiling. The chamber vanished, replaced by a vast expanse of shifting light and shadow, a horizon that seemed infinite. The protagonist stood in its center, trembling but unafraid now. The storm inside them had stilled. What remained was clarity, sharp, painful, but pure. They understood that what had haunted them wasn't a curse or punishment. It was the inevitability of knowledge. To see the full picture meant to lose the illusion of separateness. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The world began to rebuild itself around them, fragment by fragment, not the same as before, but familiar. The house above. The hallway. The morning light seeping through the window. Everything was quieter now, softer, as though existence itself had exhaled in relief. The others were there too, scattered around, dazed but alive. They remembered fragments, pieces of what had happened, but not the whole. And maybe that was mercy. The protagonist stood by the window, watching the dawn rise. The reflection in the glass was normal again. Tired eyes, a worn face, human, but deep inside, beneath the surface, they could still feel it. The pulse of that other world. Faint but steady, waiting. Not. Just quiet. Outside, the first birds began to sing. A new day, indistinguishable from the last. And yet, everything was different. The protagonist turned away from the mirror, but before leaving the room, they caught one final flicker, barely visible, almost imagined. The reflection smiled. Not haunting this time. Not warning. Just knowing. And as the door closed behind them, the faint hum of the mirror returned a low vibration, like a heartbeat continuing in the dark. The cycle had paused, but it had not ended. Not yet. Because somewhere, in some future moment, someone else would ask the same question. Someone else would stare too long into the truth. And when they did, the mirror would wake again. The protagonist knew that now that every ending is just another beginning, folded back upon itself. They walked into the light, breath trembling, heart steady. For the first time, they weren't afraid. The truth had cost them everything, but in its wake, it had given something back. Understanding. And understanding, they realized, was both the curse and the gift of being alive. As the last echo of that thought faded, the mirror pulsed once more in the empty room, casting a faint glow across the floor, like a final heartbeat before silence. Morning crept gently across the horizon, as though afraid to disturb what had been broken and remade during the night. The sky was pale gold, stretched thin over the trembling water. The protagonist stood at the edge of the lake, the same lake where everything had begun. Though now it looked impossibly still, its surface mirroring the world with perfect calm. The wind moved quietly through the reeds, whispering in tones that sounded almost human. It was hard to tell where sound ended and memory began. For a long while, they said nothing. Their reflection wavered on the water's surface, fragile, like it might dissolve if touched. The faint hum that had once filled their world was gone now, replaced by a silence that didn't feel empty, only full of meaning too large to name. The air was colder, but the kind of cold that sharpened thought instead of dulling it. The kind that made you aware you were alive. The others stood a little way off, scattered along the shore. Some watched the water. Others stared at the sky, as though trying to see if it had changed. None of them spoke about what had happened. They didn't have to. It existed between them, not as a shared story, but as a weight in the air. A quiet understanding that none of them would ever see the world quite the same again. The protagonists knelt by the water and let their fingers drift through it. Ripples spread outward, distorting their reflection until it broke apart entirely. It reminded them of the mirror, how fragile the boundary had been between what was real and what was remembered. For a moment, they could almost feel that pulse again, the echo of something vast, still breathing beneath the surface. But when they blinked, it was gone. Maybe that was the point. Maybe truth was never meant to stay. They thought of the reflection's final words, that haunting mix of sorrow and wisdom. You do not uncover what was hidden. You become it. It had sounded like a riddle then, but now it felt like understanding. The truth wasn't something to find. It was something to accept. Every question, every search, every desperate attempt to reach beyond the veil had only ever led back to one thing: themselves. Behind them, one of the others spoke quietly, as if testing whether sound still worked in this new silence. Do you think it's over? The protagonist didn't turn. Their eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, where the light touched the water. I don't think it ever ends, they said softly. I think it just changes shape. The other nodded, though there was no real comfort in the answer. They stood there for a moment longer before walking away, their footsteps fading into the whisper of the wind. The protagonist stayed behind, still kneeling at the water's edge, watching as the sun climbed higher. The light reflected off the lake in flashes of gold and white, almost blinding, almost like that final surge of brilliance in the chamber. It was strange how peaceful it felt now, as if the chaos had been necessary to make room for quiet. They closed their eyes and listened, not for the hum, not for the reflection's voice, but for the world itself. The creak of branches, the soft brush of grass, the steady rhythm of their own heartbeat. All of it was part of the same music. And within that music, there was something resembling forgiveness. Not from the mirror, not from the world, from themselves. So much of what had driven them to that place had been fear. Fear of not knowing. Fear of being insignificant. Fear of the void that waits behind every unasked question. But now, standing in the aftermath of revelation, they understood something that felt both terrifying and liberating. Not knowing was the very thing that made existence beautiful. The mystery wasn't Tiang obstacle. It was the point. A small wave lapped at their feet, gentle as a sigh. The sunlight shimmered on its crest, scattering into fragments that looked almost like the dust of the mirror dissolving one last time. The image lingered, the reflection's hand reaching out, not in warning, but in recognition. The memory no longer felt like a wound. It was simply part of them now, woven into their being, the way light is woven into water. Somewhere behind them, laughter broke through, faint, uncertain, but real. The others were talking again, their voices tentative, rediscovering what it meant to exist without fear. It felt fragile, but it was a beginning. Maybe that was all humanity ever had. Beginnings layered endlessly atop endings. A cycle of forgetting and rediscovery that kept the universe alive. The protagonist stood and took one last look at the lake. In the distance, clouds drifted slowly across the rising sun, their edges glowing like embers. For a moment, they thought they saw movement beneath the water. A flicker of light, a shimmer of something watching from below, but it faded before they could be sure. Maybe it was a trick of reflection. Or maybe it was the mirror's way of reminding them that truth never disappears, only sleeps until it's needed again. As they turned to leave, a question stirred quietly in their mind. One that felt older than language itself. What if the universe doesn't hide its secrets because it's cruel, but because it wants us to keep searching? The thought lingered like the taste of rain in the air, bittersweet and alive. It didn't need an answer. Maybe that was the answer? They began walking, following the path through the trees that led back to the world above. The forest was brighter now, the leaves moving gently in the wind. Every sound felt sharpened, the crunch of soil beneath their boots, the soft flutter of wings overhead. The ordeal had become extraordinary, as though the act of seeing itself was sacred. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun had fully risen. Its light fell across the ground in long golden lines, cutting through the mist. The others were already there, waiting. They looked tired but lighter, as if the burden they'd carried had been quietly set down. When the protagonist stepped into the clearing, their eyes met, and for a moment, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything that words never could. Then, slowly, the world began to move forward again. Someone laughed softly. Someone else cried. Life, fragile, flawed, unstoppable, began to fill the spaces where fear had once lived. The protagonist stood there for a while, taking it in before tilting their head back toward the sky. The light was almost blinding now, too bright to look at directly. They squinted, smiling faintly through the glare. The reflection's voice echoed faintly in memory. You do not uncover what was hidden. You become it. And maybe that's what it meant. That in searching for truth, humanity doesn't find something outside itself. It simply remembers what it has always been. Light seeking light. Reflection seeking reflection. They took a deep breath, letting the air fill their lungs, and for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel like a question that needed answering. It felt like a story that was still being written. One heartbeat, one ripple, one reflection at a time. The wind shifted. The trees moved. And the lake, far behind them, shimmered once more, just enough to catch the sunlight in a way that looked almost like a smile. The protagonist turned and walked toward the horizon, the sound of footsteps fading into the rhythm of the earth. The camera of imagination lingered behind, holding on the empty clearing, the trembling light, and the stillness that followed. The world seemed to breathe once more, soft and and somewhere, in the quiet space between heartbeat and echo, the faint hum returned. Not as a warning, not as fear, but as a reminder that even when the story ends, the reflection remains. Because maybe the greatest truth is this: we are not meant to conquer the unknown. We are meant to carry it, to live inside it, to let it remind us, in every fleeting moment of wonder or loss, that we are part of something far greater than understanding. The lake shimmered one final time, light bending into a perfect curve before fading to calm. And in that silence, as everything slowed to stillness, one thought lingered, quiet, infinite, and true. Perhaps the mirror never showed us what was hidden. Perhaps it only showed us what we had forgotten to see. Then the light faded, and the world, still, endless, and waiting, exhaled.